It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Arthur Whitmore laughed as he poured the vintage Cabernet over Clara Whitmore's blazer in front of the gala guests. The deep red liquid cascaded down the lapel of her off-the-rack jacket, a stark, ugly contrast to the pristine white tablecloths of the grand ballroom. The room, filled with the city's elite, fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic asterisk drip, drip, drip of wine hitting the marble floor. "Oops," he said, his voice carrying the effortless arrogance of a man who had never been told no. He didn't look sorry. He looked invigorated. He swirled the remaining inch of wine in his crystal glass, the scent of oak and dark fruit filling the small space between them. "I suppose that's what happens when you try to blend in where you don't belong, Clara. That jacket was probably a week's wages, wasn't it?" Clara didn't move. She didn't gasp, and she didn't reach for a napkin to frantically scrub at the stain. She simply stood there, feeling the cold, heavy weight of the silk sticking to her skin. Her eyes remained fixed on Arthur, noting the way his designer watch caught the light, a $100,000 piece of jewelry that he'd likely billed to the company's marketing fund. Beside him, Sarah Whitmore Vane let out a sharp, melodic snicker. She adjusted the strap of her couture gown, her diamonds flashing with every movement. "Honestly, Arthur, you've done her a favor. That polyester was a crime against fashion. Now she has an excuse to leave before the main course. We wouldn't want the Vane family thinking we have no standards, would we, Julian?" Julian Vane, the groom-to-be and scion of the Vane banking empire, shifted in his seat. He looked uncomfortable, his gaze darting between the wine stain and Clara's unnervingly calm face. He didn't speak, but his silence was its own kind of validation. He was a man who valued decorum, and right now, Clara was the one disrupting it by simply existing in her ruined state. "She's right," Arthur said, leaning in so close that Clara could smell the expensive gin on his breath. "The help usually uses the service entrance, Clara. I invited you tonight out of a misplaced sense of family loyalty, but you're an eyesore. Why don't you head home? I'll have Marcus send you a check for the dry cleaning. Or better yet, just buy a new one at a thrift store." Marcus Sterling, sitting 2 chairs down, didn't join in the laughter. The family's longtime legal counsel kept his expression neutral, but his fingers tapped a strange, rhythmic pattern against the edge of his dessert spoon. He caught Clara's eye for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps passing between them before he looked away. Clara finally spoke, her voice low and steady, cutting through the lingering giggles of the surrounding tables. "The wine is a 1982 Margox, isn't it, Arthur?" He blinked, surprised by the technicality. "It is, not that your palate would know the difference." "It's a shame," she said, her gaze drifting to the puddle on the floor. "It's a waste of a good vintage, but then again, you've always been better at wasting things than building them." The smile slid off Arthur's face. He slammed his glass onto the table, the stem snapping with a sharp asterisk crack that echoed like a gunshot. "You ungrateful little mouse. I'm the CEO of Whitmore Holdings. I built this legacy while you were playing at being a consultant in the city. You have nothing. You are nothing." "Is that so?" Clara asked. She reached into her modest clutch, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of her phone. She felt the vibration of a notification, a confirmation from the board's digital portal. She looked at Sarah, who was busy whispering into Julian's ear, likely explaining away Clara's presence as a charity case. Clara felt a surge of something hot and sharp, but she suppressed it. She had spent 5 years preparing for this. 5 years of living in a cramped apartment, wearing the same 3 blazers, and letting them believe she was the failed Whitmore. Arthur leaned over the table, his face reddening. "Get out, now, before I have security drag you out in front of everyone." Clara took a slow, deep breath, the scent of the spilled wine now smelling like victory rather than humiliation. She didn't look at the stain. She looked at Marcus, who had stopped tapping his spoon. "I'll leave," Clara said, her voice projecting with a sudden authoritative clarity that made the guests at the next table turn their heads. But Arthur, you should check your email before the appetizers arrive. There's a notice regarding the Everest Ho acquisition of the Whitmore debt. I believe the new managing partner has a few questions about your marketing expenses. Arthur scoffed, a jagged, nervous sound. Everest Ho, they don't deal with people like you. They're a global powerhouse. Why would I care about an email from a firm I've been trying to court for months? Because, Clara said, standing up and smoothing the wet fabric of her blazer with a terrifyingly calm hand, they finally finished the audit. She turned and began to walk toward the exit, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble. She didn't look back to see Arthur pulling out his phone. She didn't need to see the color drain from his face or the way Sarah's hand would fly to her throat. As she reached the heavy oak doors of the ballroom, Marcus Sterling appeared beside her, his pace perfectly matched to hers. He didn't look at her, but his voice was a low murmur as he reached out to open the door. The board meeting is set for Monday morning, 9 a.m., Marcus said. Clara stepped out into the cool night air, the wet silk of her blazer a badge of honor. Make it 8 a.m., Marcus. I want him to be the one waiting in the lobby this time. She didn't wait for his reply. She stepped into the waiting black car, the door closing with a solid, expensive thud. 2 days. She had waited 5 years. She could wait 2 more days until the Whitmore legacy was hers to burn. The laughter followed her out, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the humid night air and echoed off the stone pillars of the estate. Back in the ballroom, Arthur Whitmore raised his glass to the remaining guests, his voice booming with the practiced ease of a man who believed he was untouchable. Sarah Whitmore Vane stood at his side, her hand resting on his arm in a show of unified, shimmering arrogance. To family, Arthur announced, his eyes gleaming with malice as he watched the heavy oak doors close behind his sister. And to finally knowing our place. The guests chuckled, a ripple of sycophantic agreement that made Julian Vane tighten his grip on his own champagne flute. He looked toward the exit, a flicker of genuine doubt crossing his face. He had seen the way Clara held herself, the terrifying stillness in her eyes that didn't match the wine-stained ruin of her clothes. He had spent his life in the upper echelons of banking, and he knew the look of a person who had just lost everything. This wasn't it. Inside the black sedan, the atmosphere was entirely different. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft, expensive hum of the electric motor and the rhythmic clicking of the windshield wipers. Clara didn't look down at the wet silk of her blazer. She didn't need to. The coldness against her skin was a catalyst, a physical anchor for a rage she had kept submerged for 5 long years. He's already sent the email to the board, Marcus Sterling said, his voice low as he tapped a nervous rhythm on his leather briefcase. He's framing your departure as a mental health break. He's telling the shareholders you're unstable, Clara. Clara didn't flinch. She reached into the seat pocket and pulled out a sleek, obsidian black tablet. With a steady thumbprint, the screen came to life, displaying a complex web of shell companies and debt acquisitions. At the center of the digital web sat Everest Ho, the private equity giant that had been quietly devouring the Whitmore legacy from the inside out for 18 months. "Let him tell them whatever he wants," she said. Her voice was a sharp contrast to the shouting she had left behind. It was quiet, precise, and utterly lethal. "Arrogance is a blindfold, Marcus, and Arthur has been wearing it since the day he forged our father's signature." Her phone buzzed in her lap, a message from Arthur. "Don't bother showing up Monday. I've had security clear out your things and change the codes. I'm sure there's a waitress position open at the club if you need the charity." She stared at the words until they burned into her memory. This was the man who had relegated her to a consultant role while he bled the company dry to fund a fleet of Italian sports cars. The man who thought he had won because he was louder. "The audit is complete," she asked, her gaze fixed on the passing city lights. "Everything," Marcus replied, handing her a physical folder. The smell of fresh ink and high-grade bond paper filled the car. "We found the offshore account Sarah's been using to skim from the charity foundation, too. They haven't just been arrogant, Clara. They've been sloppy." A small, cold smile touched her lips. She wasn't the broken sister they had cast out into the rain. She was the managing partner of the firm that held their notes, their mortgages, and their very names in the palm of her hand. Arthur thought he was the lion of the family, but he had forgotten that the most dangerous predators don't roar. They wait. "I want the foreclosure notices drafted by midnight," she commanded, her voice gaining a hard, metallic edge. "And Marcus, make sure the security team at the Whitmore building is replaced with our own by 7 a.m. Monday. I want him to find his keycard useless before he even reaches the elevator." She leaned back into the shadows of the car, the scent of the sandalwood cologne Marcus wore mixing with the sterile smell of the new tablet. Arthur had spent years making her feel small, treating her like a ghost in her own home. 36 hours, she whispered to the empty air. The countdown had begun. By the time the sun rose on Monday morning, Arthur and Sarah wouldn't just be losing a board seat. They would be realizing that the person they had spent years mocking was the only reason they still had a roof over their heads. And she was about to take the roof, too. Marcus Sterling's private office was a sanctuary of mahogany and silence, tucked away in a corner of the city where the air smelled of expensive ink and old vellum. He didn't speak as he slid a heavy, slate-gray folder across the desk. The crisp snap of the high-grade paper echoed in the quiet room, a sensory anchor that made the reality of the situation settle in Clara's chest. "It's all here," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. He leaned back, his eyes tracking her every move with a newfound, sharp-edged respect. "The original deeds to the Whitmore building. The ones your father intended for you. Arthur didn't just bury them. He forged the transfer of title to his own holding company 4 years ago. It's a felony, Clara, not just a corporate dispute. A criminal act." Clara Whitmore opened the folder. Her fingers traced the embossed seal of the original document, the texture of the paper cool and slightly rough under her skin. This was the weapon. This was the blueprint for the collapse of the empire Arthur thought he had stolen. She felt a surge of cold, quiet power. For years, she had been the ghost in the halls of her own family's legacy, watching her brother dismantle their father's dreams to fund his own vanity. "And the loan?" she asked, her voice steady. "The $10 million line of credit he took out last month," Marcus confirmed, pointing to a ledger in the back of the file. "He used your personal trust as collateral. He never thought you'd check the audits because he's been gaslighting you into believing the trust was empty for a decade. He's leveraged everything on the merger with the Vane family. If that merger fails, he doesn't just lose the company. He loses his freedom." Clara closed the folder with a decisive click. "The gala is in 48 hours. Julian Vane will be there to sign the final intent papers. Arthur thinks that signature is his salvation." "And you?" Marcus asked. "I'm the one holding the pen," she whispered. The transition from the sterile, hushed law office to the suffocating opulence of the Whitmore estate felt like stepping into a trap. As she entered the grand foyer, the heavy scent of Lily's and Arthur's favorite Cuban cigars hit her like a physical blow. In the drawing room, Arthur Whitmore was standing by the fireplace, a crystal decanter of bourbon in one hand. Sarah Whitmore Vane sat on the velvet sofa, surrounded by floor plans for the upcoming gala. They looked like a portrait of triumph, unaware that the foundation beneath them was already turning to ash. "There she is," Arthur sneered, not even turning his head as she walked in. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink, the ice clinking against the glass, a sound that usually signaled an impending lecture. "I was beginning to think you finally realized how unwelcome you are here and decided to move into a shelter." Sarah laughed, a sharp, tinkling sound that held no warmth. "Be nice, Arthur. We need her to look presentable for the gala. Julian's parents are very traditional. We can't have the poor relation looking like she's been sleeping in the attic, even if she has been." Clara didn't flinch. She stood in the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the strap of her bag where the gray folder was hidden. "I'll be there, Sarah. Don't worry about my appearance." Arthur set his glass down with a heavy thud on the marble mantel. He walked toward her, invading her personal space, his expensive cologne, something woodsy and aggressive, clogging her senses. "You'll be there, but you'll be in the overflow seating at the back. I've already moved your name plate. You're a charity case, Clara, a footnote. Don't you dare try to speak to Julian or his father. This merger is my legacy. I won't have you embarrassing me with your pathetic existence." The entitlement in his voice was a physical weight, but Clara simply met his gaze. She saw the sweat on his brow, the slight tremor in his hand that he tried to hide by gripping his lapel. He was terrified, and his only defense was to make her feel small. "Your legacy," Clara repeated softly. The irony tasted like iron on her tongue. "I understand perfectly, Arthur. Everything will be settled at the gala." "Good," he snapped, turning his back on her as if she had already ceased to exist. "Now get out. Sarah and I have actual business to discuss. People with real money are talking." Clara turned and walked toward the stairs. Behind her, she heard Sarah whisper, "She's so plain, it's almost tragic. I don't know how we're related to her." "We aren't," Arthur replied, his voice carrying up the staircase. "She's just a ghost we haven't exorcised yet. But Monday morning, after the papers are signed, she's out. I'm selling the estate to a developer. She can find a new haunt." Clara reached her room and locked the door. She didn't turn on the lights. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed and pulled the folder from her bag. In the moonlight filtering through the window, the forged signatures seemed to glow with a sickly light. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text to Marcus. "The countdown is at 48 hours. Ensure Julian Vane receives the pre-merger briefing I prepared. He needs to know exactly whose hand he's shaking before he commits his family's fortune." She looked at the clock. 2 days. 2 days until the man who had mocked her poverty realized he was the one who was truly bankrupt. She lay back, the silence of the room finally feeling like peace instead of isolation. The blueprint was complete. All that remained was the execution. Arthur Whitmore tapped a gold fountain pen against the heavy oak desk, the rhythmic asterisk click, click, click echoing through the study like a countdown. He didn't look up when Clara Whitmore entered, his attention fixed on the architectural renderings spread before him. The smell of expensive cigar smoke hung heavy in the air, cloying and arrogant. "I've decided the East Wing will be the first to go," he said, finally glancing at her with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "The developers want to break ground by next month. I assume you've started packing your trinkets. I wouldn't want the bulldozers to accidentally crush your memories." Clara moved to the window, her fingers grazing the cold, heavy velvet of the curtains. She could feel the weight of the phone in her pocket, the digital tether to the storm she had unleashed. "The estate has been in our family for 4 generations, Arthur. You're selling a legacy for a temporary liquidity boost." "I'm selling a liability," he snapped, the pens clicking stopping abruptly. "Legacy doesn't pay the interest on the firm's overhead. Julian Vane is bringing in enough capital to make us untouchable. By this time tomorrow, the Whitmore name will mean more than just old dirt and drafty hallways. It will mean power." Sarah Whitmore Vane drifted into the room, her silk heels silent on the Persian rug. She moved to Arthur's side, placing a manicured hand on his shoulder. "Don't waste your breath, Arthur. She's always been sentimental. It's a symptom of a small mind." She turned her gaze to Clara, her eyes narrowing. "Julian and I are hosting a private dinner tonight at the club. Don't bother showing up. We wouldn't want your dour energy ruining the celebration." Clara turned from the window, her expression unreadable. "I wouldn't dream of it. But Arthur, foundations built on sand don't just shift. They swallow everything above them. Are you absolutely certain the Vanes have seen every ledger? Transparency is the soul of a merger, after all." Arthur let out a sharp, barking laugh. He stood up, leaning over the desk until he was inches from her face. The bitter aroma of oversteeped Earl Grey tea on his breath was suffocating. "Transparency. You're talking to the CEO of Whitmore Holdings. I am the soul of this company. The Vanes see exactly what I want them to see. That's how real business works, Clara. Not that you'd understand anything beyond dusting the furniture and playing the martyr." He tossed a leather-bound folder toward her. It skidded across the oak, stopping inches from her hand. "Sign the waiver for the estate sale. Now, I want everything tidy before the morning meeting." Clara didn't touch the folder. Instead, she checked her watch. It was 10:00 a.m. In Julian Vane's private office, a courier would be delivering a pre-merger briefing, a document that Marcus Sterling had ensured contained the original, unforged audit trails. "I think I'll wait," she said softly. "Wait for what?" Sarah sneered. "A miracle. You have no leverage, Clara. You're a ghost in your own house." "I'm waiting for the truth to catch up," Clara replied. She met Arthur's gaze, her pulse steady. Sometimes the things we think we've buried have a way of surfacing exactly when the tide goes out. Arthur's face flushed a deep, angry red. He slammed his palm onto the desk, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Get out! I'm done listening to your riddles. By noon tomorrow, you'll be out of this house and off the payroll. I'm revoking your access to the family accounts. Let's see how long your truth lasts when you're looking for a place to sleep." Clara didn't flinch. She simply nodded and walked toward the door. As she reached the threshold, Marcus Sterling stepped into the hallway, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He caught her eye for a fraction of a second, a sharp, knowing look that told her the first domino had fallen. "The Vane family lawyers are on line 1, Arthur," Marcus said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Julian wants to move the pre-signing meeting up to this afternoon. He says something unexpected has come to his attention." Arthur straightened his tie, his arrogance instantly returning. "Probably wants to toast the deal early. Sarah, get your coat. Clara, try not to steal the silver on your way out." He brushed past her, followed by a smirking Sarah. Clara stood in the empty study, the silence finally feeling like a weapon. She pulled her phone from her pocket and saw the notification. Briefing delivered. Julian is reading. The countdown wasn't at 48 hours anymore. The clock was ticking in seconds, and Arthur Whitmore was walking into a room where the door only locked from the outside. The Vane estate smelled of old money, beeswax, and a suffocating floral arrangement that dominated the center of the library. Arthur stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, swirling a glass of amber liquid that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He didn't ask for the drink. He simply took it from the sideboard the moment they arrived, acting as if the mahogany and leather belonged to him already. He adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of the glass, a smirk playing on his lips. Beside him, Sarah smoothed the skirt of her designer dress, her eyes darting around the room with a hunger for status that was almost physical. "Look at this place, Arthur," she whispered, her voice tight with excitement. "Once the merger is finalized, we'll be hosting our own galas here. No more pretending to tolerate the commoners." He chuckled, the sound deep and vibrating with unearned confidence. "The commoners are a thing of the past, Sarah. By sunset, the Whitmore name will be synonymous with the Vane legacy. We're moving into a different stratosphere." He took a long, slow sip of the scotch, feeling the burn in his throat like a victory. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and Marcus Sterling stepped inside. The lawyer looked paler than usual, his jaw set in a hard line. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply walked to the long conference table at the center of the room and began unzipping his leather briefcase. "You're early, Marcus," Arthur noted, turning from the window. "Eager to get the commission? I don't blame you. It's a life-changing sum." Marcus didn't look up. "It's a significant day for everyone involved, Arthur. Where is Julian?" "The groom is likely preparing his victory speech," Sarah chimed in, checking her reflection in a silver tray on the table. "He knows a winning horse when he sees one." The atmosphere in the room shifted a moment later. It wasn't the sound of the door that changed it, but the sudden, sharp click of heels on the marble foyer outside. The rhythm was steady, deliberate, and entirely lacking the hesitant shuffle of someone who felt out of place. Clara walked into the library. She wasn't wearing the faded, sensible wool coat she'd worn for years. Instead, she wore a tailored navy suit that hugged her frame with professional precision. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe knot, and her gaze was as cold as the ice in Arthur's glass. She didn't look like the sister they had spent a decade belittling. She looked like a predator entering a familiar hunting ground. Arthur let out a sharp, derisive laugh, though his grip on his glass tightened. "What is this, Clara?" "Did you find a costume shop on your way to the unemployment office?" You look like you're playing dress-up." Sarah sneered, stepping closer to her brother. "Is that a knockoff, Clara? You really shouldn't try so hard. It only makes the desperation more obvious. You're a ghost in this family, a smudge on the name. Why are you even here? The staff entrance is around the back if you're looking for a handout." Clara didn't flinch. She walked to the opposite end of the table, pulling out a chair and sitting down with a grace that made the room feel smaller. She placed a slim, black leather folder on the table and rested her hands on top of it. "I'm here for the meeting, Arthur. I wouldn't miss it for the world." "The meeting is for stakeholders and principals," Arthur snapped, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "You are neither. You're a charity case we've tolerated out of a misplaced sense of duty. Marcus, tell her to leave before I have security drag her out of Julian's house." Marcus remained silent, his eyes fixed on the documents in front of him. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until the side door opened and Julian Vane entered. Julian didn't look like a man about to celebrate a merger. His face was a mask of aristocratic stone, his eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't look at Arthur. He didn't look at Sarah. He walked straight to the head of the table, his presence commanding the air in the room. "Julian," Arthur exclaimed, his voice regaining its oily charm. "We were just about to have Clara removed. She seems to have some delusions about her invitation." Julian sat down, his movements slow and methodical. He looked at Arthur then, a long, chilling stare that made the older man's smile falter. "Clara is here at my personal request, Arthur. In fact, we cannot proceed without her." Sarah blinked, her hand going to her throat. "What do you mean? She has nothing to do with the business." "She's just Clara." "Is she?" Julian asked, his voice a low rumble. He gestured to the folder in front of Clara. "I spent the last 4 hours reading a very detailed briefing. It seems there are layers to the Whitmore family finances that you neglected to mention during our negotiations, Arthur." Arthur's laugh was brittle. "Whatever she told you is a lie, Julian. She's bitter. She's always been jealous of my success. You can't possibly take the word of a woman who has spent her life living off my table scraps." "I don't take anyone's word," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. He leaned forward, the scent of expensive tobacco and cold steel seemingly radiating from him. "I take evidence, and the evidence suggests that you've been hollowed out from the inside. It suggests that Everest Holding isn't just a silent partner in your firm. It suggests they own the very chair you're sitting in." Arthur felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. He slammed his glass onto the table, the crystal clinking sharply against the wood. "That's absurd. I am the CEO. I built that company." "You built a house of cards," Clara said quietly. It was the first time she had spoken since sitting down, and her voice cut through his bluster like a razor. She opened her folder, revealing a single gold-embossed document. "And you used my cards to do it." Arthur glared at her, his lip curling. "You're nothing, you have nothing." "We'll see," Julian interrupted, his eyes shifting to the clock on the wall. "The pre-signing audit is complete. Marcus, would you care to explain the new discovery regarding the majority share distribution?" Marcus finally looked up, his gaze landing on Arthur with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "There has been a filing error in the public records for the last 5 years, Arthur. An intentional one, it seems. The controlling interest in the Whitmore Group isn't held by the estate. It's held by a private entity registered in the Cayman Islands." Sarah let out a shaky breath. "So, Arthur controls that entity?" "No," Marcus said, his voice as flat as a tombstone. "He doesn't." Julian stood up, the movement abrupt and final. He looked at Clara and gave a sharp, respectful nod. "The floor is yours, managing partner." Arthur's face went white. He looked from Julian to the silent lawyer and finally to his sister. The gutter rat was leaning back in her chair, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. The room went silent, the only sound the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, counting down the seconds until the world Arthur had built vanished beneath his feet. "Wait," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "What did he just call you?" Clara didn't answer. She simply slid the document across the polished wood toward him. "Read the signature line, Arthur, and try not to spill your drink. It's a very expensive table." Arthur Whitmore stared at the signature line, his hand trembling so violently that the heavy cream paper rattled against the polished mahogany. The silence in the room was absolute, a thick, suffocating weight that seemed to press the very air from his lungs. The only sound was the rhythmic, relentless ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, each beat a hammer blow against the foundation of the life he had built on a throne of arrogance. He blinked, his vision blurring, but the elegant, decisive script didn't change. It was her name. It had always been her name. The transformation was visceral. The arrogant flush that usually stained his cheeks drained away in a terrifying rush, leaving his skin the color of damp ash. His jaw, once set in a permanent sneer of superiority, unhinged slightly, his mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged O that made him look suddenly, pathetically old. A fine sheen of cold sweat broke across his forehead, glistening under the crystal chandelier's harsh light, while his eyes, usually sharp with calculated cruelty, turned glassy and unfocused, darting toward the corners of the room like a trapped animal seeking a hole to crawl into. His nostrils flared with every ragged, shallow breath, and the muscle in his left cheek began a frantic, rhythmic twitch that he seemed utterly powerless to stop. He looked less like a titan of industry, and more like a man watching his own execution in a slow-motion mirror. "This is a mistake," he whispered, the words catching in a throat that had gone bone dry. "Marcus, tell her this is a mistake." Marcus Sterling didn't move. He stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the evening light. He didn't offer a hand or a reassuring word. Instead, he simply adjusted his glasses, a thin, clinical smile playing on his lips as he watched his employer's world dissolve. "The filing is legitimate, Arthur. It has been for 3 years. You've been a figurehead, operating at the pleasure of the majority shareholder. And it seems her pleasure has reached its end." Across the table, Sarah Whitmore Vane made a sound like a punctured tire. Her manicured fingers clutched the edge of the table so hard that her knuckles turned a ghostly, bloodless white. She looked from her brother to the woman she had spent a lifetime belittling, her expression a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The gutter rat she had mocked for her off-the-rack clothes was now the hand that held her leash. Julian Vane leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a slow, deliberate grace. The disdain he had carried for Clara Whitmore all evening evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating respect. He was a banker. He understood power, and he realized with a jolt of adrenaline that the real power in the room had been sitting in the shadows the entire time. He didn't say a word, but he shifted his seat 6 inches away from Sarah, a silent, public divorce of interests that spoke louder than any shout. Clara stood up. The movement was fluid, devoid of the frantic energy that now consumed her brother. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply leaned forward, her palms flat on the cool, expensive wood of the table. "You spent 20 years telling me I didn't belong in this family because I didn't have the stomach for the business," she said, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. "You told me I was a charity case, a shadow. You were so busy looking down at me that you never noticed I was the one holding the floor up." She turned her gaze to Sarah, who shrank back into her chair. "The trust fund that pays for your villas and your vintage wine. It's an Everest subsidiary. I signed the order to freeze the accounts 10 minutes before I walked into this room. You'll find your credit cards stop working by midnight." Arthur tried to speak, his hands grasping at the air as if he could catch the dignity he had dropped, but no sound came out except a pathetic, wet wheeze. "The board meeting is at 8 tomorrow morning," Clara continued, picking up her modest handbag. "Security will be at your office at 7 to supervise the removal of your personal items. Don't bother taking the company car. I've already had it towed." She didn't wait for a rebuttal. She didn't stay to watch him weep. She turned on her heel, the sharp click of her heels on the marble floor echoing like a countdown. As she reached the door, she paused, looking back one last time at the wreckage of the dynasty. "You were right about one thing, Arthur," she said, her hand on the brass handle. "I don't belong here, I own the place." She stepped out into the hall, the heavy doors swinging shut behind her with a final, echoing thud, leaving the room in a silence so deep it felt like the bottom of a grave. The bitter scent of over-roasted coffee hung heavy in the boardroom, mingling with the clinical smell of expensive leather and floor wax. It was exactly 8 o'clock. Arthur sat at the head of the mahogany table, his fingers drumming a frantic, uneven rhythm against the polished wood. He had spent the night trying to move funds, trying to call in favors, but every door had slammed shut before he could even reach the handle. Beside him, Sarah looked frayed, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the dark circles under her eyes. She kept adjusting her pearls, the repetitive clicking of the gems the only sound in the oppressive silence. "She's bluffing," Arthur muttered, though his voice lacked its usual booming resonance. He looked toward Marcus Sterling, who sat at the far end of the table, his face a mask of professional indifference. "Marcus, tell the board this is a clerical error. Everest Holdings can't just absorb a legacy like this overnight. It's a legal impossibility." Marcus didn't look up from his tablet. "The documents were filed and verified at midnight, Arthur. There is no error." The heavy double doors swung open. Clara entered the room with a stride that was neither hurried nor hesitant. She wasn't wearing the modest, muted tones of a personal assistant anymore. She wore a charcoal suit that fit with surgical precision, her hair pulled back into a sharp, uncompromising knot. Behind her, 2 men in dark suits took positions by the door, security, but not his security. Arthur surged to his feet, his chair screeching against the marble floor. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here. This is a private board meeting. Security, remove this woman." The security guards didn't move. Clara didn't even blink. She walked to the opposite end of the table, directly facing him, and placed a slim, silver flash drive on the table. "Sit down, Arthur," she said. Her voice was low, carrying a weight of authority that seemed to physically press against the air in the room. "You're making a scene in front of your betters." "My betters?" Arthur let out a harsh, jagged laugh, looking to the other board members for support. Julian Vane sat among them, his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed in cold calculation. "You're a clerk playing dress-up, Clara. You've spent too much time filing my papers and you've started to hallucinate." Clara ignored the insult, nodding toward Marcus. The lights dimmed, and the massive projector screen at the front of the room hummed to life. The face slap moment didn't come from a physical blow, but from the first slide that appeared. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a high-resolution scan of the original Whitmore family trust, alongside the acquisition records of Everest Holdings. Arthur's face underwent a violent transformation. The ruddy, self-assured glow of a man who believed himself untouchable drained away, leaving behind a sickly, gray pallor that made him look 10 years older in an instant. His eyes, usually sharp with predatory intent, widened into vacant saucers of disbelief, darting frantically between Marcus and the screen as if the ink might magically rearrange itself into a lie he could manage. A single bead of sweat broke from his hairline, tracing a slow, jagged path down his temple, while his lower lip began a rhythmic, uncontrollable quiver. He tried to speak, but his throat seemed to have constricted into a dry pinhole. All that emerged was a wet, clicking sound that died before it reached the air. His hands, which had been gripping the edge of the mahogany table, began to shake so violently that the water in his crystal glass rippled in concentric circles. "As of 6:00 a.m., Marcus announced, his voice echoing in the stunned silence, "Everest Holdings has executed a total debt-for-equity swap. Arthur Whitmore, your personal guarantees on the bridge loans have been called. You currently hold 0 voting shares in this company. In fact, you technically owe the firm $4 million in overdrawn executive draws." Julian Vane leaned back, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to a cold, clinical disdain. The other board members followed suit, physically recoiling from Arthur as if his failure were contagious. One woman near the end of the table audibly gasped, her hand flying to her throat as she realized the man she had followed for a decade was a hollow shell. "Clara, honey," Sarah started, her voice trembling as she reached across the table. "We're family. I always knew you were the smart one. I tried to tell Arthur to listen to you, I really did." Clara turned her gaze toward her sister. The look was so icy, so utterly devoid of sentiment that Sarah's words died in her throat. "You didn't tell him to listen, Sarah. You told him how to hide the offshore accounts. I have the recordings of those conversations, too." "Marcus will be handing those to the SEC this afternoon." Sarah sank back into her chair, her face turning a ghostly white as she realized her golden child status had just become a liability. Arthur finally found his voice, though it was a pathetic, high-pitched rasp. "You can't do this. I built this. My name is on the building." Clara picked up her flash drive and tucked it into her pocket. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the board members who were already scribbling notes, likely calculating how to distance themselves from the wreckage of the Whitmore name. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, the absolute master of the space. "The sign comes down at noon," Clara said, her voice cutting through Arthur's stuttering protests. "You were so busy looking down at me that you never noticed I was the one holding the ladder. And now, Arthur, I'm letting go." She turned on her heel and walked toward the door. "Clara, wait!" Arthur screamed, stumbling as he tried to round the table. Security stepped forward, a firm, silent barrier between the fallen king and the woman who had taken his crown. Clara didn't look back. She stepped out into the hallway, the heavy mahogany doors clicking shut behind her, sealing Arthur inside the tomb of his own making. As she walked toward the elevators, the sound of her heels on the marble was the only thing she heard, steady, rhythmic, and final. 6 months after the gold-plated letters were stripped from the lobby wall of the Whitmore building, the silence was what Clara Whitmore noticed most. Her new office on the 42nd floor of the Sterling Everest Tower didn't echo with the performative thunder of shouted orders or the frantic scurry of terrified assistants. Instead, it hummed with the quiet, efficient pulse of a machine that finally worked. The air here didn't smell of Arthur's stale cigar smoke and desperate bravado. It smelled of rain-slicked glass and the faint, clean scent of the eucalyptus sprigs sitting in a ceramic vase on her desk. Clara sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, a simple gold fountain pen resting between her fingers. She wasn't wearing the modest, mouse-colored sweaters Arthur had so often mocked. Today, she wore a tailored suit of charcoal silk that felt like a second skin, not a costume of power, but a uniform of self-possession. A soft chime preceded the door opening. Marcus Sterling walked in, carrying a single manila folder. He didn't look like the weary, guarded man who had spent years navigating Arthur's legal minefields. He looked settled. He placed the folder on the desk and took a seat without being asked, a gesture of mutual respect that would have been unthinkable in the old regime. "The final liquidation is complete," Marcus said, his voice steady. "The estate in the Hamptons sold this morning. After the creditors were satisfied and the legal penalties for the fraud were deducted, there was nothing left for him." Clara didn't feel the surge of triumph she might have expected. She felt a profound sense of equilibrium. "And where is he, Marcus?" "A 2-bedroom rental in Queens," he replied, leaning back. "It's a walk-up. I'm told he spends most of his time at a local dive bar, telling anyone who will listen that he's just one deal away from a comeback. They call him the King of Nowhere behind his back." Clara looked out at the city. She could almost see the neighborhood Marcus described, a place of gray concrete and the constant, rhythmic rattle of the elevated train. She imagined Arthur Whitmore there, his expensive wool coat fraying at the cuffs, his face flushed with the bitterness of a man who still couldn't understand that a crown built on the backs of others was never truly a crown at all. "And Sarah?" Clara asked. "Sarah Whitmore Vane is currently in a private clinic in Switzerland," Marcus said, a note of clinical detachment in his voice. The Vane family was quite thorough. Once the scandal broke and the extent of the embezzlement was tied back to her, consulting, fees, Julian Vane moved for an immediate annulment. The social exile was more than she could handle. She's technically safe, but she's been erased from every guest list from Manhattan to Milan. Julian has already moved on. He's been seen with a human rights attorney from London. The cost of the victory sat in the room like a ghost. Clara had her company, her reputation, and a wealth that Arthur could only have dreamed of, but the family tree was a charred ruin. There would be no more Sunday dinners, no more shared holidays. The Whitmore name survived through her, but the Whitmore family was a casualty of its own arrogance. "He sent another letter," Marcus added, pulling a crumpled envelope from his pocket. "He's demanding a meeting. He says he has an opportunity for you to restore the family honor." Clara didn't take the envelope. She didn't need to read the desperate, looping script she knew would be filled with the same entitlement that had nearly destroyed them all. "Return it to sender, Marcus. Tell him the managing partner of Everest Ho is unavailable. Permanently." Marcus nodded, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. He stood to leave, pausing at the door. "You know, they're still talking about that final board meeting. The way you walked out, it's become something of a legend in the district." "I wasn't walking away from a fight, Marcus," she said softly. "I was walking toward a life." When he left, Clara stood and walked to the glass. Below, the city was a tapestry of lights and motion, millions of lives intersecting in a chaotic dance. She placed her hand against the window, the surface cool and unyielding. In the reflection, she saw a woman who no longer had to hide her strength to keep the peace. She thought of Arthur in his cramped rental, listening to the pipes hiss and the neighbors argue through thin walls, still waiting for a ladder that she had long ago let go of. The revenge wasn't in his poverty, it was in her indifference. She had reclaimed her name, her father's legacy, and her own future. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and golds, Clara picked up her pen and returned to her work. The view from the summit was breathtaking, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the height. She was exactly where she belonged.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.